While their families were imprisoned behind barbed wire in American concentration camps, they were dying for America in the forests of Europe. Let that sink in for a moment. October 1944. The Vosges Mountains in eastern France. A Japanese-American soldier from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team checks his rifle one more time. His hands are shaking, not from fear, but from the cold and exhaustion. He's been fighting for 6 days straight. Around him, the forest is silent except for the occasional crack of distant gunfire and the whisper of wind through pine trees heavy with moisture. 211 men are trapped half a mile ahead. American soldiers from Texas, surrounded by German forces, cut off from food, water, and ammunition. The entire Allied command is desperate to save them. They've tried everything. Nothing has worked. So they sent the Japanese Americans. The same Japanese Americans whose parents are locked up in camps in California, Arizona, and Utah. The same Japanese Americans who had to prove they weren't the enemy by volunteering to become bullet shields for a country that didn't trust them. The same Japanese Americans who chose a motto that would define them forever: go for broke. The soldier looks down at the patch on his uniform. Go for broke, gamble everything, risk it all. He knows the math. His unit has already lost more men in this war than almost any other regiment in American history. They've been replaced 3 times over. Every position has been filled by a new body at least 3 times. That's a 314% casualty rate. The numbers don't lie. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Those 211 trapped soldiers are white men from Texas, a state where Japanese Americans couldn't even buy property, couldn't testify in court, couldn't marry who they wanted. And now, these Japanese American boys are about to walk into a meat grinder to save them. The order comes down the line. Fix bayonets, check ammunition, move out. But what none of them know yet, what history will try very hard to forget, is that this rescue will cost them everything. And 50 years later, most Americans still won't know their names. This is the story of the most decorated unit in American military history that nobody talks about. To understand why this matters, we need to go back 3 years earlier. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The next day, America declared war on Japan, and within weeks, something unprecedented happened on American soil. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. With a stroke of a pen, 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were ordered to leave their homes. 2/3 of them were American citizens, born on American soil. It didn't matter. They looked like the enemy. Within months, 10 concentration camps were built across the American West. Not death camps, but prison camps. Families were given less than a week to sell their homes, their businesses, their entire lives. They could only bring what they could carry. Everything else, gone. Manzanar, Tula Lake, Hart Mountain, Poston, Minidoka. These weren't temporary shelters. These were barbed wire prisons in the middle of deserts and wastelands, guarded by soldiers with machine guns pointed inward. And while this was happening, thousands of young Japanese-American men made a decision that defies logic. They volunteered to fight for the country that imprisoned their families. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was formed in 1943. 14,000 Japanese-American soldiers would eventually serve in this unit. Most of them came from Hawaii. Many came straight from the camps. They trained in Mississippi, where locals wouldn't serve them in restaurants. They prepared for war in a country that treated them like prisoners. Now, let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that Hollywood never wanted to touch. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team earned 18,143 individual decorations. That includes 21 Medals of Honor, the highest military decoration in America. It includes 52 Distinguished Service Crosses. It includes 560 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, and 9,486 Purple Hearts. 9,486 Purple Hearts. That's the medal you get when you bleed for your country. To put this in perspective, the 101st Airborne, the famous Screaming Eagles, The band of brothers unit that everyone knows from the TV series received fewer medals of honor despite being nearly 3 times larger. The 442nd had a 314% casualty rate. Read that again. 314%. That means every single position in the unit had to be filled more than 3 times because the original soldier was killed, wounded, or missing. They went through their entire roster 3 times over. They fought in 8 major campaigns across Italy, France, and Germany. They liberated towns. They broke through the Gothic line. They rescued the lost battalion. They liberated Dachau, one of the Nazi concentration camps, while their own families were still imprisoned in American camps. And yet, when the war ended and the Hollywood movies started rolling, when the history textbooks were written, when the monuments were built, the 442nd disappeared. D-Day got movies. Iwo Jima got movies. The Battle of the Bulge got movies. The 442nd got silence. For 50 years, most Americans had no idea this unit even existed. The most decorated unit in American military history was erased from the national memory, not because they failed, but because their faces didn't fit the narrative of what an American hero was supposed to look like. So when we talk about the rescue of the lost battalion in October 1944, we're not just talking about a military operation. We're talking about men who had every reason to walk away, who had every justification to say no, who chose to bleed for people who wouldn't even let them drink from the same water fountain. Let me take you into the forest. Late October 1944, the Vosges Mountains in northeastern France. If you've never been there, imagine this. Dense pine forests so thick that even in daytime, the light barely reaches the ground. The trees grow close together, their branches intertwined overhead like a cathedral ceiling made of shadow. The ground is soft, muddy, soaked from constant rain. Every step makes a sucking sound as your boot pulls free from the earth. The temperature hovers just above freezing. You're wet all the time. Your uniform never dries. The moisture seeps into your bones. At night, you can't light fires because the Germans will see the smoke. So you shiver in your foxhole, clutching your rifle, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to guess which sounds are wind and which sounds are enemy soldiers moving through the darkness. This is where the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, the Texas unit, made a critical mistake. They pushed too far, too fast, chasing retreating German forces, and on October 24th, the Germans turned around and closed the trap. 211 American soldiers found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from supplies, from reinforcements, from any hope of escape. For 3 days, they held on. They rationed their ammunition. They ate tree bark. They drank from puddles. They sent radio messages begging for help. And the Allied command tried everything. Artillery bombardments, airdrops that missed the target, frontal assaults that were beaten back with heavy casualties. Nothing worked. That's when someone made the call. Send in the 442nd. Private First Class Barney Hajiro was 28 years old. Before the war, he had worked on a sugar plantation in Hawaii. His family wasn't in the camps, but he knew what was happening on the mainland. He had joined the 442nd anyway, believing that military service would prove Japanese Americans belonged. Years later, in his memoir, he would write about the moment they got the order to rescue the lost battalion. He wrote, "We knew it was a suicide mission. We knew the forest was full of German machine gun nests, that the terrain favored defense, that we would be walking into a kill zone. But we also knew that if we didn't go, those boys from Texas would die. And despite everything, despite the camps, despite the hate, we couldn't let that happen." The attack began on October 27th. Imagine this. You're moving through forest so dense you can barely see 10 feet ahead. Every tree could hide a German soldier. Every shadow could be a machine gun position. The ground is muddy and uneven. You're carrying 60 pounds of equipment. Your rifle is slippery with moisture. Then the shooting starts. Machine gun fire from 3 directions at once. The distinctive rip of German MG-42 seconds, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound is unlike anything else in war, a tearing, buzzing scream that makes your stomach drop. Bullets chew through tree bark, sending splinters flying. Men drop around you. Someone screams. Someone else goes silent. You hit the ground. You crawl forward, inches at a time. The mud soaks through your uniform. Your hands are numb. You can taste gunpowder and pine needles and fear. For 6 days this continued. 6 days of non-stop combat in terrain that belonged to nightmares. Daniel Inouye was a young officer in the 442nd. Decades later, he would become a United States Senator, serving Hawaii for nearly 50 years. But in October 1944, he was a 20-year-old second lieutenant, leading men through hell. On April 21, 1945, during a later battle in Italy, Inouye would charge 3 German machine gun nests, single-handedly. A German grenade would blow off his right arm. He would pry his own severed arm's fingers off the grenade he was still holding, throw it with his left hand, and continue fighting. He would receive the Medal of Honor, but in the Vosges forest in October 1944, he was just another soldier pushing through the mud and the gunfire, watching his friends die for people who didn't consider them real Americans. Sadao Munemori wasn't as lucky as Inouye. On April 5th, 1945, near Seravezza, Italy, Munemori's squad came under fire. A German grenade landed in their position. Munemori didn't hesitate. He dove on top of it. The explosion killed him instantly but saved his squad. His mother received his Medal of Honor while still living in a concentration camp in Arizona. Think about that. Her son died saving American lives, and she accepted his medal behind barbed wire, surrounded by armed guards, in a prison camp on American soil. Back in the Vosges, the 442nd pushed forward, meter by meter, body by body. They didn't have artillery support. They didn't have air cover. The forest was too dense. This was close-quarters combat, fought with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. On October 30th, they broke through. The Japanese-American soldiers of the 442nd reached the Texas Battalion's position. The scene that greeted them was devastating. Emaciated soldiers, their faces hollow with starvation and fear. Some were too weak to stand. Many were wounded. All of them were on the edge of death. And here's the moment that history forgot to preserve: the silence. There was no cheering, no celebration. The rescuers looked at the rescued. The rescued looked at the rescuers, and in that moment, something unspeakable passed between them. Recognition, shame, gratitude, guilt. The cost? 800 casualties. The 442nd suffered more than 800 killed and wounded to save 211 men. One soldier later wrote in his journal, "We rescued Texas. Texas couldn't save itself. But when we got home, Texas still wouldn't let us drink from their water fountains." Part 4. The Psychological Defeat. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. Millions celebrated in the streets, ticker tape parades, kisses in Times Square, heroes coming home. The 442nd came home too, but their homecoming was different. The soldiers from Texas, the men of the Lost Battalion, they went back to their towns and were treated like the heroes they were. Parades, newspaper articles, job offers, the GI Bill paying for their college educations, helping them buy homes, start businesses. The Japanese-American soldiers of the 442nd went back to camps. Not all of them. Those from Hawaii had it easier, but the ones from the mainland, the ones whose families had been imprisoned, they came back to find their homes sold, their businesses gone, their property seized. They came back to signs that still read, "No Japs allowed." They came back to neighbors who wouldn't look them in the eye. They came back wearing uniforms covered in medals, carrying wounds that would never fully heal, and they were still called the enemy. Imagine that psychology for a moment. Imagine bleeding for your country, watching your friends die for your country, earning the highest honors your country can give, and then coming home to a country that still doesn't trust you because of your face. One veteran, interviewed in the 1990 seconds, said this: "We proved our loyalty with blood. We proved it over and over. We died at a higher rate than almost any other unit. We earned more medals. We never retreated. We never surrendered. And it still wasn't enough. America still looked at us and saw the enemy. The 442nd didn't talk much about their service after the war. It wasn't like today, where we celebrate veterans constantly. These men came home and went silent. They got jobs. They raised families. They tried to forget. Because remembering hurt too much. Remembering meant confronting the fact that heroism has a color in America. That sacrifice has an acceptable face. That you can do everything right, everything your country asks of you, and still be erased from history because you don't look like the hero in the movie poster. For decades, the 442nd existed in a strange limbo. Officially recognized but publicly invisible. Their records were documented. Their medals were real. But their story wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't made into Hollywood films. It wasn't part of the national narrative of World War II. And the cruelest irony? Many of the men who fought in the 442nd died never knowing if their story would be remembered. They died wondering if their children and grandchildren would ever learn what they sacrificed. They died with the fear that all their pain, all their courage, all their blood spilled in foreign forests would simply disappear into silence. It took 50 years. 50 years before the story of the 442nd began to be told widely. 50 years before their medals of honor were properly upgraded and recognized. 50 years before America began to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that it had imprisoned and forgotten its own heroes. But here's the question that haunts this story. How many of those soldiers died in those 50 years of silence, believing that their sacrifice meant nothing? How many went to their graves thinking that America had forgotten them completely? That's not a casualty of war. That's a casualty of memory, and it's a wound that never heals. Part 5. The philosophical conclusion. Here's what the story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team teaches us about history, about memory, about who gets to be a hero. Courage doesn't have a color. But apparently, glory does. The men of the 442nd did everything America asked of them and more. They bled more. They died more. They earned more medals. They never broke. They never surrendered. They rescued those who needed rescuing, even when those same people wouldn't share a meal with them back home. And for half a century, America responded with silence. This isn't ancient history. Many of the 442nd veterans lived into the 2000s. Some are still alive today. They spent most of their lives watching World War II movies that never mentioned them, reading history books that skipped their chapters, visiting memorials that forgot their names. The uncomfortable truth is this. We choose who becomes legend. We choose whose sacrifices get remembered, and whose get filed away in archive boxes that nobody opens. We choose which faces fit our national story and which ones complicate the narrative. The 442nd complicates everything. They make us confront the fact that America imprisoned people for looking like the enemy while simultaneously asking them to die as heroes. They force us to ask, what does loyalty mean when it only flows one direction? What does patriotism cost when your country doesn't believe you belong? Every time we celebrate World War II, every time we talk about the greatest generation, every time we watch another D-Day documentary, we should ask ourselves, whose stories are we not telling? Whose blood are we forgetting? Whose heroism are we erasing because it makes us uncomfortable? The 442nd proved they belonged. They proved it in blood and mud and frozen forests in France. They proved it by saving people who didn't think they were worth saving. The question isn't whether they deserve to be remembered. The question is, how many other stories like this are still waiting in the archives, waiting for someone to care enough to tell them? Go for broke, they said. Risk everything. They did. And we forgot. Don't let it happen again.